Hello, everyone. It's great to see you. Today, it's wonderful to welcome you to our 7th Global Existential Challenges seminar series of the year. The last one will be May 2nd, and it will focus on Indigenous politics. My name is Deborah Yashar. I'm the director of Pierce and also professor in the Politics Department and SPIA. And obviously today, you're here to see our incredible panel focused on global poverty and precarity. In many ways, this topic needs no introduction. We all know that poverty and precarity are important, and we're living in a world where it's both present and simultaneous with growth and innovation in other spheres. But even with that growth and innovation, we know that poverty and precarity remain challenging issues around the world, not just elsewhere, but also here in the United States, with deep and enduring structural conditions that disproportionately affect some communities over others, oftentimes exacerbated by exogenous shocks, whether or not we're talking about economic crises or violence or pandemics and more. And thankfully, in the context of those deep and challenging structural conditions and the concerns about exogenous shocks, we also know that there is an informed and committed policy community that wants to understand the interventions to try and combat these issues at a local scale, at a national scale, and indeed globally. And so we couldn't be more fortunate today than to have our 3 speakers to address these issues, both the deep and enduring challenges as well as the interventions going forward. It's a wonderful group, and I want to first just share a few things that they have in common before I introduce each of them separately. They're all relatively new to Princeton, so we are very fortunate to have them in this room together. As I'll note, starting in 2022, 2023, and soon to be 2024. They're all highly accomplished, prolific, and award-winning scholars. I won't go through all of their scholarship and all of their awards, but I encourage you to go to their websites, which are incredibly interesting. They are, moreover, all multidisciplinary scholars. So even though they're leaders as economists and leaders as psychologists, just by way of background, they have some education in physics, engineering, philosophy, and even English. And they are, moreover, interested, as I said, in policy interventions to reduce poverty and precarity. So there's a lot of similarity in terms of their backgrounds, but obviously each of them has specialized in particular areas. So we're going to start off with Seema Jayachandran, who's a professor of economics and public affairs. She is the old one in the crowd. She started in 2022, although obviously she's had positions before that, before she came here. She's a prolific scholar whose research and writing have focused on environmental conservation, gender equality, health, and other microeconomics topics, particularly focusing in developing countries. She is, moreover, an active member of many intellectual and policy communities. I'll mention just a few. She's on the board of directors at JPAL, which is the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, again, more commonly known as JPAL, and moreover leads JPAL's gender sector. She's also co-director of the National Bureau of Economic Research Program and Development Economics and co-editor of the American Economic Review Insights. And as if that wasn't enough, she's also on the board of directors of CARE, amongst many other issues. So in the spirit of interdisciplinarity, Seema is the one who has the background in physics and electrical engineering, in addition to being an economist. And today she'll focus on precarity and the effects of climate change. She would be followed by Pascaline Dupas, who's a professor of economics and public affairs. She joined in July of 2023. So again, it's wonderful to welcome her into our community. She is also a renowned development economist who studies the root causes and challenges facing poor households in lower income countries. And her ongoing research includes studies of, for example, education policy in Ghana, family policy planning in Burkina Faso, and government subsidized health insurance in India, amongst many other projects. Like Seema, she's a member of many intellectual communities. I'll just mention a few. She's co-president of the Bureau for Research and Economic Analysis of Development, otherwise known as BREAD. She's a board member and affiliate of JPAL, which I just mentioned also for Seema, and she's a research associate at the National Bureau for Economic Research in NBER. She's the person who studied philosophy and economics before coming here, and today's talk will be focused on relative versus absolute poverty and the implications of relative rank consideration on the design of anti-poverty programs and measurement of welfare. And then third, Anuj Ahah is currently an associate professor at Chicago's Booth School. In a way, he's the oldest member of the group because he got his PhD here at Princeton, but he will be the newest member of the group because he'll be starting as an associate professor in psychology and SPIA starting in the summer of July 2024. So you're an old one in the group, but also a new one who is joining here. We're really delighted to welcome you back. It has to be noted that Anuj did not only come from Chicago, but I was told minutes before coming in that his heroic effort to get here included diverted plane rides from Chicago, diverted to other cities, including driving this morning from Pittsburgh, did you say? From Pittsburgh. So he is a committed scholar and colleague, soon to be friend. And we're very excited to hear about his work, which is multi-method research using cognitive and social psychology as a lens into social issues, particularly focusing on issues like poverty, crime, and violence. And his work includes lab and field experiments, amongst other research methods. He, too, is interested in policy interventions to help people better navigate unpredictable situations where conflicts are likely to arise. And that will be the focus of his talk today, where he'll look at two interventions. The first intervention focusing on reducing youth violence, and the second focusing on reducing police uses of force against community members. And as he noted in the comments to the group, these impacts are particularly pronounced in poor communities where this type of situational uncertainty is most common. So I hope you're excited. I'm excited to hear the three of them speak. I want to note just a few things before I turn the floor over to them. The talk is taped, as are most of the talks in this seminar series, so obviously be mindful of the fact that this will be taped, and if you want to go back and review anything, it will be posted online. Each speaker will have about 15 to 18 minutes, so if you see me saluting them, it's both that I'm excited about their talk and also it's time to wrap it up. So they will each have 15 to 18 minutes, and then that will be followed by Q&A, where our three speakers will come here to the front. So please give them a warm welcome. We're excited about the thought-provoking presentations and vigorous conversation. And we'll start with Seema.
All right. Thank you, Deborah, for the introduction, and thanks, everyone, for coming. Let's see, how do I... Am I going to help? It's pretty hard to see this. Okay. No, that was not what I wanted to do. I don't know if this is actually Adobe. Okay, terrific. Well, I'm happy to kick us off, and I'm going to talk about one aspect of precarity and poverty, which is its relationship with climate change. So, as probably most people know, could intuit or have seen evidence on, the global poor are especially vulnerable to climate change. So even if there were no adaptation, no adjustment to the fact that climate change is here, it's going to get worse, at least two aspects of life in developing countries makes people more vulnerable. First, climate change is both going to increase the volatility of climate, but it's also going to have average effects of making climate hotter, and poorer countries are hotter to start with. So going from moderate to warm is not as bad as going from hot to hotter, for example, for human health. And then second, more of the economy and more of people's livelihoods is around agriculture. So lots of industries are susceptible to climate change, or productivity is hurt across the board by climate change, but especially in agriculture. But what really makes the vulnerability, the likely impacts worse for the global poor is that they have less ability for adaptation. And adaptation is often divided into two pieces, an idea of resilience, or kind of ex post, after the fact, recovering from, say, a natural disaster, and then ex ante, adapting, making changes in anticipation of those hotter temperatures or those natural disasters. That's partly just because resilience and adaptation require money. If you have less income, it's going to be less easy to buy an air conditioner or pay for the electricity bill for an air conditioner during heat waves. That's beyond financial resources. A lot of of adaptation and resilience requires governments to play an important role, and there's less government or state capacity to build levees or seawalls or rebuild infrastructure. And there's also more political fragility. So there's growing evidence that one of the implications of climate change, for example, after droughts, is a higher likelihood of civil conflict or of coups or other abnormal political transitions, which could then have longer run impacts on people's economic well-being. So here's just one kind of figure to show you, to make the point that about recovery or resilience after natural disasters. This is from a study by Sol Shang and one of Anuj's colleagues, Amir Jina, which is looking at the long-run effects on GDP per capita after tropical storms. And so they're coded up. What this is plotting is how GDP per capita changes as a function of how intense that tropical storm was. And you could see that for the first 15 years after those tropical storms, GDP is getting worse and worse and worse. And it starts to tick up a little bit after year 15. But certainly there hasn't been a rebounding, and it doesn't look like it will occur at all or for many years. And that's actually, it stands in contrast to a lot of work in economics and conventional wisdom that in rich countries, places rebound after the destruction of physical capital. We think of cities or places having some natural advantages, and so if they're destroyed, yes, that's costly to rebuild, but they're going to rebuild because there's a lot of potential there. There are high returns to capital and rebuilding there, and so they rebuild and they recover. So, for example, a lot of that work is like thinking about after World War II when cities rebounded. Think of Europe after World War II, and that just doesn't seem to be the case for these natural disasters in poor countries. One of the aspects of climate change is going to be health and mortality, and this is a figure of projections of the effects of climate change on mortality, where the redder colors are a higher rate of mortality due to these changes in temperature. And you could see it's concentrated in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and other low and middle income countries. And, it's also in the Gulf. So part of it is initial temperature, but it's also about all of those people's initial health is more fragile, and their access to healthcare is going to be more limited. And so for all of those reasons, we expect the climate change to be especially hard for the poor. So I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about two projects of mine that speak to this question of resilience and adaptation in the face of environmental shocks. And, interestingly, like neither of these projects I framed as I did them around climate change. And I think, kind of climate change came upon us quickly, or at least came upon, I think, researchers in a lot of fields, and that, it's sort of arriving, it's people are already feeling the impacts. And so, I think it's an area I'm going to, a lot of my work is on the environment, but a lot on the mitigation of climate change. But I certainly expect that more of my research is going to be on adaptation, just because it is such an important topic for the welfare of the global poor. So this is what I'm first going to talk about is a project that, where one of the maybe punchline of it is a way in which through markets, one person's inability to be resilient actually has negative spillovers to their neighbor. So there's sort of an amplification effect of a community being very poor on how climate shocks affect them. And so this is, in the language of economics, it's about general equilibrium effects, or how prices adjust. So general equilibrium effects are people make their own individual behavioral adjustments to something like a drought, and that through markets and through prices, what happens, there can be broader effects on their community. And so, the starting point for that is that poor people have fewer ways to respond to a negative weather shock. If I had some sort of, tenure professors aren't a great example for this job of a recession hitting us, and we have a negative economic shock to us. What do people do? They can borrow. If their income is lower, they can borrow so they can tide themselves over during that period where they're not earning as much income. They have some savings and they can draw from those savings, but poorer people aren't going to have access to those banks and financial resources. The other thing you could do is migrate. You could shift occupations, but a lot of it is you're going to migrate somewhere else. Migration takes money, and so you can be too poor to be able to migrate. And in addition, many of the poorest people in the world are in pretty remote areas. And then, the other thing you could do is just say, I'm going to tolerate having lower income and therefore lower consumption. I can cut back on, from 21 meals a week to 19, and that's okay. But if you're, cutting back from 14 to 11, that's a lot harder. And so if you're very close to subsistence, you don't have the same luxury of being able to reduce your consumption and still being okay. And so, what does that mean? It means that what a lot of wealthier people will do if their wage falls is work less. They'll say, it's not as attractive to work now. I'll work less, and I'll, and I'll get by some other way. Take through savings or through, just cutting back in consumption. But for the poor, you can't afford to do that. So you, in fact, keep working, even if you're getting paid a lower wage, and you might actually work more. If you need to make at least $1 a day to survive and your wage gets cut by 10%, you might work 10% more hours. And so the title of this paper, which was part of my dissertation, was Selling Labor Low. The price of labor is low, and yet people are selling as much or more of it. So just to show you this in supply and demand graphs, what you can think about it as a poor person or in a poor area, labor supply is more inelastic. And so that's what I'm showing you on the right here. Inelastic labor supply means it's not moving as much when the wage changes. It's more vertical because even as the wage is changing, labor supply is pretty constant. That's saying people aren't cutting back their labor. If they actually were supplying more labor, then it would be what economists call a backward bending labor supply curve. It would be to the left or counterclockwise from vertical. Whereas in a richer place, people are changing their labor more in response to wage changes. And so what do you want to think about as a negative weather shock, like a heat wave or a drought? And empirically in this project, I looked at droughts or abnormally low rainfall in India. You're going to think of that as labor demand, there being less labor demand. If harvest has collapsed or half the crops died, the landowners don't need as many people to be picking their crops, and so they're going to not want to hire as many people, or they're going to be hiring people at a lower wage. And so, what happens in those cases, with lower labor demand, there's going to be lower wages. But the distinction between the left and the right is the wage is going to fall more on the right-hand side. So this is, some sort of bitter irony of being poor. The very fact that you're poor means the same drought is going to have a larger negative effect on your well-being because the wage fell more. And so, what's happening here is kind of when people are pulling out of the labor market, like on the left, that's an automatic stabilizer of sorts. So you got hit with this negative labor demand shock. Some of your neighbors are pulling out of the labor market, so that's at least kind of cushioning the fact of how much wages fell. If everybody needs to keep working, then that shock is going to be worse for your actual take-home pay. And you see that empirically. And so in this project, this is using data from across India, where I'm just showing you one of the results where, what it's really looking at is how sensitive is the wage to bad rainfall. So when the rainfall is bad, this is basically kind of a below the bottom quartile of rainfall. You see that in places, the typical community district in India, wages fall by 16% in those years. And if you look at the places with more financial access and have more banking, then it still falls, but not nearly as much, by 7%, so half as much. Or, you could think of, I could have shown you, made these bar graphs differently. If you look at the places that even have one standard deviation below average banking, it's going to be it's not going to minus 16%, it's going to be minus 23%. So the same drought, how much it affects people's well-being is going to be a function of their financial access. And you see the same thing with their ability, kind of proxies for their ability to migrate, or just the depth of poverty in the community. Okay, so the second project I'm going to talk about is is about water use or utility use, and it's thinking about, and it's kind of examining how one of the tools in our arsenal to try to protect the environment of corrective pricing, how that's influenced by dynamics within households, and specifically in our context between gender dynamics. And it's, so it's showing that gender inequality within the household. So in husbands having a lot more power over household budgets than wives do, that's going to be a barrier to conservation because it makes corrective pricing less effective. So, it's one of the, how do we protect the environment? We could either say you can't use gasoline at all, or you can't use some fixed natural resource at all, or we try to have a price for it that incorporates this externality. So, we want to have Pigouvian pricing, or pricing so that people are not just thinking about how much it's enjoying it, but also having to internalize the negative externality. It's why we have a gasoline tax. And so, that's increasingly important in the context we're looking at in Southern Africa. The increased amounts of droughts is causing water scarcity. So some people might know maybe 6-7 years ago, Cape Town got very close to running out of water, barely escaped that disaster, and that's expected to increase as we go forward. So in this project, which is forthcoming, it's probably not as recent as it looks. It's just a function of how long it can take to publish in economics. We're studying how gender inequality in the household makes this corrective pricing less effective. So just to kind of lay out the conceptual point, one thing that's unique or relatively unique about household utilities like water bills, piped water, or electricity is they're billed at the household, not individually. And it's really hard to know how much each individual consumed. So, when we survey people don't know how much water they used, let alone other people in their household. And so because you don't even know how much you use, you can't back out from a total, even in a 2-person household, how much the other person is using it. And so that means there's scope for free riding. These are families, they care about each other, so there will be some altruism, but people, might not be completely altruistic towards other people in their household. So if they have to take the colder shower or the shorter shower, they're going to have to put in that effort, kind of have all of that disutility from that less enjoyable shower. But, when the water bill comes, they're not necessarily getting all of the benefit. So we share the financial savings in the household. So that would be true even if everybody was equal within a household. We're kind of doing all of the effort to turn off the tap while we're brushing our teeth, but we're splitting the savings with other people in our household. But what makes it worse is if there's inequality within the household. So when, for example, in like an extreme where one person controls all of the financial resources, they get all of the benefit. If there's a lower water bill or a lower electricity bill, then yes, they have an incentive to conserve, but the other household members have zero incentive to conserve. And that lack of equality on average is going to mean the household's going to conserve less. So if the husband's controlling all of the money, and the wife in the household is going to have less incentive to conserve. And so we're seeing this in Livingston, Zambia, where that's kind of the setup. When we kind of ask households if the water bill is higher or lower, who has less discretionary money to spend, it's going to be mostly the man who has all of the financial upside and downside, whereas the woman is actually the one who's the bigger water user. And so we have a couple ways to look at that. One is we can sort of vary. This is with a randomized experiment where we can't vary a regulated price, but we give people some rewards if they have a lower water bill. So that's basically like raising the price of water. And so in this one case, we tell the couple, we're using heterosexual couples, so there's always a husband and a wife, and we tell them that, hey, if you conserve water, you are going to get this prize. And then we compare households based on whether financial power is shared equally or unequally, and we see that we're measuring kind of how elastic is water use to the price. It's very elastic in those equal households, and it's much less elastic or responsive to prices in these unequal households. A second way we have doing it is to kind of set an individual price. So, this is not easy to do in reality of giving a price for one person in the household. That's the part and parcel of the problem. But for us, we can tell only one person privately about this prize for having a lower household water bill. And we can see when we tell the wife about this personal prize, she doesn't have, if she wants to keep it private, she's not changing her husband's or her kids' water use, but she can change it. And you see that then the household's much more likely to actually have an overall reduction because, in the status quo, she was not being that careful about her water use. And so she can reduce the household water bill a lot if she's given financial incentives. Okay, so I'm not going to try to do a broad, try to wrap those into a conclusion, except to say that I think the impacts of climate change are just going to be huge for the global poor, and they're exacerbated by the fact that already people's lives are precarious, and it's going to increase the precarity of the lives of the global poor. So thank you.
All right. So I panicked a little bit when I was told I would have 15 minutes to talk about global poverty and precarity, and it was kind of like an introduction to my new colleagues and students here. So I was like, oh my God, what am I going to talk about? I wanted to talk about everything, everywhere, all at once, just like the movie. And then I decided I'm going to do something that's actually maybe taking a step back and helping us think a little bit about what we mean when we talk about poverty or how it is experienced by people. And so I'm going to kind of zoom kind of like in. And so instead of showing you some numbers about what we talk about when we talk about global poverty and showing the massive gaps in standards of living between higher and lower income contexts, I'm going to zoom in on the local context and think a little bit about how even your relationship with your neighbors when they are also poor, but maybe not as poor, is actually also an important factor in people's quality of life and how they are being treated. And we're going to think about how that interacts with their behavior. And so the starting point is the idea that, it's been well established everywhere around the world that we care about our relative place in society, not just our material welfare. Maybe the most striking example of that is some old experiment that was done with Harvard undergrads way back when, where they showed that 2/3 of Harvard undergrads would prefer to earn $50,000 a year in a world where others earn $25,000 over earning $100K in a world where others earn $200K. So maybe it's just Harvard students and the Princeton undergrads would not be like that. But it's just like an indicative of the fact that people care a lot about their relative status in society. And this idea that we care about our relative rank and that it matters for our economic behavior is not new. It's been long hypothesized and discussed. You may be very familiar with the term conspicuous consumption, dating back to Veblen and Owens, or keeping up with the Joneses, dating back to Duesenberry in 1949. And more recently, people have cited, in the context of low-income countries, lavish weddings or funerals as examples of this type of conspicuous consumption. But while both Veblen and Duesenberry were primarily concerned with the upper classes, today I want to bring up the fact that rank concerns may affect the poor as well, and that in fact it may be affecting them in very nasty ways. There's very abundant anecdotal evidence that appearing poor is bad for you. It's bad for how people treat you. It can attract scorn, ridicule, discrimination, and moral condemnation. And people who are in situations of poverty very much often complain that they are not being respected by others. And in turn, this can have, also down spiral effects on self-respect. And in fact, the English language itself thinks, there's this expression, to look respectable. Okay? So your appearance matters for whether or not others should respect you according to the English language. And so what we're going to think about in a project I'm going to briefly discuss is this idea that keeping up appearances to gain the respect of others may be optimal from an individual point of view. But the way to do that may be through distorting your consumptions in ways that may appear, irrational if you don't take into consideration this aspect. And so I'm going to share a research project I've been doing in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, with Marcel Fafchamp, my former colleague at Stanford, and Laura Hernandez Nunez, who was our pre-doc and now is a PhD student at Columbia University. And in this project, we've been investigating what we think are two important questions in the thinking about the welfare cost of relative rank considerations. The first one is kind of like the premise that we're going to establish is, whether individuals who appear more likely to who appear poor are more likely to be victimized. And so we're going to show that's the case. So there is anecdotal evidence that people experience it this way. We're going to show that, in fact, people think that the poor are victimized, and indeed they are. And then the key investigation that we were interested in is the extent to which people respond to this by distorting their behavior to manipulate their perceived rank to avoid victimization. And why does it matter? It matters because it's going to have important implications for the design of anti-poverty programs. I'm going to come to that at the end. So very briefly, I'm just going to give you some snippets of how we've been doing this. It's actually not at all representative of my research agenda more broadly, because the type of methods we use here are much more on the lab type of experiments and not this many years field experiment that I've been doing for most of my career. But I've actually been quite excited to learn about these new methods and find it quite insightful. So I'm excited to share that with you. So this is in the context of a broader data collection exercise in Abidjan, which is the primary economic center of Côte d'Ivoire. Has been rapidly urbanizing, and we've been serving folks who live in the periphery of the city, people who've recently migrated from rural areas, and we're trying to understand more broadly the extent to which this urbanization phenomenon, how it works, and how cities could better prepare for the arrival of urban migrants. But so in this context, we've been surveying individuals, and as part of the survey, we used a mix of vignettes and lab in the field experiments to look at these research questions. Our sample is relatively poor. We focused on relatively poor areas, but within that sample, we do have heterogeneity in socioeconomic status, so that's what this histogram is showing you. And to test the first hypothesis, which is that individuals who appear to be of lower rank are believed to be victimized, we didn't want to, put people in real situations and increase the risk of them being victimized. So we did what we call vignette experiments. So these vignettes have the following structure. You ask somebody in a survey to tell you, what they think would happen in a given scenario. So the vignettes, the flavor typically is something like, okay, I'll present you some profiles of people and some situations. Please rank from 1 to 10 each profile and each person according to their likelihood of facing each situation. And we did a number of those, but I'm only going to show you a few to look at different aspects of appearance. The one I'm going to show you is how people's consumption patterns are being used as signals for their poverty status. And so in particular, we asked people to tell us whether they thought folks would get an interview for a job. So we said a supermarket or some other organization is interviewing people for a position of supervisor. How likely do you think this candidate is to be selected for the interview? And we give a little CV, and we vary across, respondents or across vignettes, what's on the CV. But the primary thing that we manipulated experimentally by randomizing across profiles is whether or not we mention the choice that the applicant for the job had made for some things, that in principle are completely innocuous, which is whether or not, conditional on getting an interview, they said they would rather get a free meal or a keychain or something. And so the idea here is that if you're poor, maybe a free meal is more attractive than if you're not poor. And if you have the choice of a free meal and a keychain or a tote bag or a pen, you pick the free meal. People may assume that then you're poor, okay? And so we vary whether or not people see, we vary which choice people see you've made. Okay, so you said I would have the free meal versus you would have the keychain. And then we see whether that matters for the perceived likelihood that you get an interview. So that's what these regression tables show you. I regress the likelihood that the respondents think that you're going to get an interview or invited to join a charity committee, or an interview at the supermarket, or an interview by an NGO, as a function of various characteristics that we vary on the vignettes. And the striking result is that if you selected the free meal, you are much less likely to be thought as a likely candidate for these positions. Okay, and the magnitude is actually pretty big, because if we do something similar, but we vary your education level, we find that having gotten secondary education increases the likelihood that you get these opportunities by about a 0.5 standard deviation. And so the fact that having selected the free meal reduces these opportunities by about 0.4 of a standard deviation is pretty much like not having secondary education compared to having it. So it's a pretty strong effect. So just, if I know that when you had a choice between a free meal and a tote bag or a keychain, you chose a free meal, I think you're less likely to be considered worthy of being on a charity committee or of getting interviewed for a job. We have similar vignettes where we look at the role of physical appearance, where we ask the same person to, we take a picture of the same person in different outfits, looking more or less, poor, and we find that also people perceive that the person who the same person but dressed less fancy is much more likely to be accused of burglary or suspected of other stuff, and less likely to be invited to social gatherings. So we have a lot of evidence that people do believe that your appearance and your consumption matters for how you're going to get opportunities or how you're going to be victimized. And then we check whether these beliefs are correct by asking a panel of judges to select people based on pictures on CVs for a series of opportunities. And we find that these markers of ACS do matter for what actual opportunities are given to you. Okay. So next, the question is going to be whether people adapt to this, victimization linked to poverty by distorting their behavior. And so for that, we can replicate the vignettes where we actually did hire people for a job. We said we call people up and say we are looking to hire people for a job. It was a mini job. It was only half a day job. But what we randomize is whether or not people were told, okay, among all the people who are willing to take the job, we're going to randomly pick who we hire, or whether we told them we're going to select based on a few questions. Okay, so people, would either thought, okay, I have a random chance of getting the job, or I'm going to be screened. And what we are looking at is the extent to which knowing that there's going to be a screening changes the likelihood that you choose the free meal when we ask the question, okay, assuming that you get the job, when on the day you do the job, at the end of the job, you can either get a free meal or you can get a pen. And so we test exactly whether when people are in a situation where they think that in their screening, they want to minimize any signal that could be sent about their poverty level. And so that's what we look at here. And we find that the likelihood that you select the free meal is significantly lower if you're in a screening treatment, which means that the mean here tells you that 57% of people say they want the free meal. Okay, so they are much more interested in a free meal. This is a relatively poor population, so they want the free meal. But if they know that there is a screening, they are 7 percentage points less likely to say that they want the free meal. So this is, it was random whether it's screening or not screening. So this is evidence that they are strategically under asking for the free meal as a way to, as per our hypothesis, avoid sending a signal that they are poor. And then when we look at who is more likely to engage in this behavior, is the people who are actually at the bottom and middle of the distribution. So we have a model in a paper that actually predicts that this is not going to be something that affects differently people according to where they're in the distribution. And indeed, we find that these people who are poor to start with, as well, the most likely to want the free meal in the first place, who respond to this. Okay. We have another experiment. I don't know how well I'm doing on time, but we have another experiment where we look at another ways through which people can manipulate their appearance. This is what we call a photo experiment, where we ask people if we can take a picture of them for our own records. But then we have a treatment group where we additionally tell them that if with their consent, we will be showing the picture to a local panel that will select participants for to be invited to be in a documentary about Abidjan. Okay, and then we offer people the option to spend some effort into generating another picture. So we say, if you want, we can come back and take another picture at a time of your choice. Okay, and so our hypothesis is that respondents are going to be willing to pay in time or in effort to produce a photograph that make them look higher rank in order to improve their chances of being selected for the documentary. And so this is what we find. So people who were told that they could, people who were told that there would be a screening by a panel of judges and the photos would be ranked are 5 percentage points or 6% more likely to ask us to come back. And when you look at actually whether they were there when we showed up and whether they participated in a second photo shoot, this increases by 9 percentage points. So if they know that we're going to be selecting based on the picture, they try hard. They make an effort to produce a second picture. That second picture, when we look at who are the people who produce this second picture, it's again the people who are at the lower end of the SES distribution that engages this behavior. So people who are trying to generate a nicer looking photo are those who are poor to start with. And then, are they successful at producing a photo that looks higher SES? Now, all of the pictures that we took, we actually then ask people to rate them on a number of things, like including SES. Okay, so when we look at the rating of the pictures, we find that the second photos, the distribution of SES scores dominates, indicating that they are on average rated as higher SES, and then when we do this with individual fixed effects, within the very same person pictured twice, their second picture is rated as being higher SES, and then so that's what you can see here. So it's like holding constant the respondent, their prepared photo as a higher SES score. They also look more beautiful as a placebo. We check whether they also look more fat. It's pretty hard to change your corpulence within a month or so, and we don't see an effect there. So that's doesn't make sense. And then when we show these different photos to people and ask them, based on this photo, do you think this person is more or less likely to get an interview at the receptionist for a hotel, or be invited to be on the charity committee, or be invited to be participating in a documentary about the Mighty in Abidjan, or invited to a social gathering? We find that the prepared photo is perceived to be more likely to lead to these positive outcomes for people. And so it's like, not only people paying time and effort to produce a second photo, but that second photo indeed makes them look less poor and hence rated as being more likely to benefit from positive opportunities. And then, in fact, realized outcomes are better, because when we asked our panel to select people based on photos for who should come to this documentary about Abidjan Terre d'Opportunité, which means Abidjan Land of Opportunities, people with prepared photos were much more likely to be selected for this. A documentary saying about the challenges of life in Abidjan, then they were much less likely. So it's really like people are able to manipulate their appearance in a way that changes the opportunities that are available to them, making them more positive and less negative. So to conclude, this is kind of a bunch of small manipulations at the margin that suggest that signals of socioeconomic status, such as your physical appearance and your consumption choices, affect the likelihood that you're going to be victimized, or that you're going to get, in the flip side, positive opportunities. And people are definitely aware of that, responding to that by distorting their consumption behavior to manipulate their perceived rank and limit the likelihood that they face victimization. So, this suggests that the true inequality actually may be much greater than the perceived inequality. And in our context of Abidjan, when we surveyed many people and asked them how much they knew about the relative poverty of their neighbors, people had very little information. If we asked them to rank their neighbors by order of income, they were completely wrong. very little information, which is very different from rural areas where people have been living together for so many years. They can observe how well your field is doing. But in urban and peri-urban areas, people are much better able to kind of like fudge their appearance, and so there's less information out there. And so we argue that this has important implications for the targeting and design of anti-poverty programs. So our model and also our results show that it's going to be easy to identify the really, really, really destitute, because they are not going to manipulate their behavior because it's too costly for them. So they really need the free meal. They're going to get the free meal. They don't care for, the pen or the tote bag. But people who are kind of like not quite that destitute, and maybe those who are, in precarity, like just at the border, are going to try to blend in with the less poor. And identify them is going to be really tricky. And so, when we design anti-poverty programs, we have to think about whether we give help in kind or in cash. And if you take this seriously, it means that giving people cash is actually going to be much better from their welfare, because they can choose to spend some of the money on signal goods, spend the money on things that are going to help them appear less poor. And as a paternalistic social planner, you may be like, no, I'm giving you money. I don't want you to buy a keychain. I don't want you to buy a tote bag. I want you to buy more food. So I'm going to give you food. But, that actually may make it harder for people to not end up being stigmatized. Okay. Likewise, this is also coming back to an issue that if, availing yourself of a anti-poverty program is a signal that you're poor, that may lower take-up. And Moffitt had an old paper on that showing that the food stamps in the US, the way it's set up makes it very costly for the poor to benefit from, because you have to go to a special shop, and everybody knows that you're using your food stamps, and so that dampens take up, because it's a signal that you're poor and you're going to be victimized for it. There's also a number of appeals for what's called community-based appraisals, where you ask people to say in the community who should get help, who is poor, and in a context where people are going to hide where they are, you're not going to go very far with that. Finally, there is some recent evidence for a number of concepts that perceived inequality tends to be lower than true inequality. That's true both, in Denmark, Hong Kong, Abidjan, many contexts. And we think this could be because, people are trying to garble the signal about where they are in the society, and that's going to affect preferences for redistribution and safety nets. And finally, how we think about measuring poverty and precarity is also a little bit tricky, because, in economics, we tend to think of consumption smoothing as a holy grail. Like, if you can have smooth consumption and not have periods like hungry seasons, it's better for you. But how about if, people actually would rather eat less for a week in the month, so that during the first 3 weeks of the month, they can kind of like blend in and keep up appearances by having the same consumption patterns as people who are less poor. Maybe they are better off that way, because that's how they can get respect from others and dignity. And so who are we to judge that your optimal consumption pattern should be one where you only have, cornmeal every day of the month rather than... So I think these are some of the issues that this help bring to light, and I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
I've already learned a lot by being on this panel. From the first few talks, I'm super grateful for the chance to be a part of this panel. And let's see. Okay. So, poverty creates many different forms of uncertainty, whether it's uncertainty about income or about work or about the possibility of displacement or the fragility of one's health, or even about uncertainty about your safety in your community. And today I'm going to talk about a couple different interventions that are sort of based on trying to improve safety in one's community. And while these aren't anti-poverty programs per se, I think you'll see that the impacts are going to be largest in poorer communities and communities of color. And the title of this talk will make more sense in about 7 slides. And the motivation really kind of starts with an argument over a bicycle. And it took place on a Saturday afternoon in the South Shore neighborhood, a few miles south of the University of Chicago's campus, where I've worked for the past 12 years. And it starts with a disagreement between two groups of teenagers. And it's really kind of a mundane argument over whether some kid stole another kid's bike. And the heat seems to be falling out of the argument. The groups are dissipating or separating when all of a sudden something sets somebody off. And a handgun gets pulled out of a waistband and a trigger gets pulled and a 16-year-old is shot in the chest and pronounced dead at the hospital. And the thing is, we might have an idea of what violence looks like in a city like Chicago or elsewhere. The truth is that this is what a lot of violence looks like. It's not necessarily deeply calculated, but it stems from an altercation that just sort of escalates into an argument that might escalate further into an act of violence. We estimate that some 70% of homicides in Chicago start like this, just stem from some random altercation. And then there might be a retaliation that happens with a little bit more planning, but still not a whole lot of what we might think of as thought. And when so much violence occurs over so little of what seems like substance, it can make the problem seem ingrained and immutable and impossible to fix. But over the last 10 years or so, we've had the chance to evaluate a couple different programs that have been remarkably effective at reducing youth involvement in crime and violence. And I'll start by telling you about one program called BAM, or Becoming a Man. It was created by a person named Tony DiVittorio. It's administered by an organization called Youth Guidance in Chicago Public Schools. That's where I'll spend more of my time to start, but I'll also tell you about a program that's based on some of the same foundations that's being done in the Cook County Juvenile Detention Center that looks very different, but is based on those same foundations. And to get a sense of those foundations, you can look at the very first exercise that they do on day one of the BAM program. And it's an exercise called the fist. And the way it starts is a counselor will pair up two young men, and they give one of the kids a ball, and he says, "I want you to make a fist around this ball." And the kid says, "I can do that." Then he says to the other kid in the pair, he says, "Here's what I want you to do. For the next 60 seconds, I want you to do whatever it takes to get the ball from your partner." And the counselor gets this kind of wry smile across his face, and he says, "By the way, there's just one rule. There are no rules. Go for it." You can imagine what happens over the next minute. You've just told teenage boys, take something from somebody else. There are no rules. They beat the crap out of each other. They're fighting, they're clawing, they're doing whatever they can to get the ball from their partner. At the end of that minute, the counselor leads them through a debrief, and he says, "Okay, what do you all do to try to get the ball?" And the kids come alive talking about how they physically punished their partner until they did or did not give up the ball. The counselor says, "That's great. That seems to be working out really well for you." And then the counselor asks what we'd all recognize as a corny question. He says, "How many of you just thought to ask for the ball?" And none of the kids raise their hands. He says, "Well, why not?" And the kids say, "Well, he would have called me a wuss. He would have made fun of me. There's no way he would have given me the ball if I just asked." So the counselor goes around to each of the kids who start with the ball, and he says, "What would you have done if your partner asked for the ball?" And without fail, the kids say, "I would have given him the ball. I'm not a psychopath. I don't need this ball. But once he starts punching me, now we've got bigger problems than who's going to get this ball." And this exercise is kind of great, right? It's subversive. You're giving kids a chance to fight with each other in a controlled environment. But more importantly, it's highlighting for these kids something that's familiar to us behavioral scientists, which is that you're showing these kids the assumptions they make automatically and the things they do without thinking very much about it. That is, you're showing them what happens when they think fast, and then over the course of the program, the counselors try to give the kids the tools they need to think slow. So in the one-year version of this program, kids are meeting in groups of about 12 to 15 kids for an hour a week, up to 27 weeks. And there's a lot of exercises like this where the counselors get these kids into a hot state, and then they intervene to say, well, are your assumptions really warranted in this situation, or is there another way to see this situation instead? So there's some exercises like this. There's some lecture also, and there's a lot of checking in throughout the program as well. And we had a chance to evaluate this program on a couple of different occasions. First in 2009 to 2010, where we randomized 2,700 7th to 10th graders. Either they get BAM or they getting other after-school programming, or 2013 to 2015, when we randomized 2,000 9th and 10th graders to either get BAM or other programming. And you see that this program is remarkably effective at reducing youth involvement in crime and violence, leading to reductions by about 37 to 50%. It also increases school engagement that translates into a boost in graduation rates by about 12 to 19%. So this is a remarkably effective program. And at its core, it's loosely based on principles of cognitive behavioral therapy, although this doesn't look like the kind of therapy with a one-on-one therapist, but rather it's about getting kids to notice the role that their own thoughts play in shaping how they interpret a situation and how they respond to that situation. And the Cook County Juvenile Detention Center in Chicago, around this time, they were also doing a CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy-based program as well, although it looked very different. So there, the kids are higher risk. They're not in school at the time. They're there for about 3 to 4 weeks. And we also randomize about 2,700 kids to pods where they receive this CBT-based programming, or pods where they were not receiving it. And even though the program looks different, you still see that it's having remarkable effects, reducing recidivism by as much as 21%, 18 months out. And these two evaluations sit alongside, I think, a growing body of evidence that programming like this can be effective at reducing involvement in crime and violence. Chris Blattman, for example, my colleague in Chicago, has an intervention where he finds that for men at risk in Liberia, that when you combine CBT-based programming with cash transfers, that has a longer lasting effect. I think he's finding effects 10 years out, longer lasting than just cash alone, for example. And so even though my talk is very US, actually very Chicago-centric, we see effects like this elsewhere too. And I think what's amazing about these programs is that they don't sit there and lecture kids about what to do. In fact, they don't say, don't fight back. That would be one way to reduce their involvement in crime and violence. But instead, I think what these programs are doing is they're teaching kids situational awareness. They're getting kids to pause and put a question in their mind along the lines of, well, is the situation that I first think I'm in really the situation that I am actually in? Or is there another way to see it instead? And I think this situational awareness looms large for kids who might be growing up in tougher neighborhoods. And to appreciate what I mean by that situational awareness, think about a couple different scenarios. So imagine that you're a teenager and you're making lots of noise with your friends in a movie theater and someone bigger than you tells you to sit down and shut up. Or imagine that you're a teenager and you're making noise with your friends in your classroom and your teacher tells you to sit down and be quiet. Now, in some ways, those feel like a similar situation, where someone more powerful than you is telling you to sit down and be quiet because that's what the norms of the situation call for. Now, if you were like me and you grew up as a middle-class kid in suburban Maryland, then you would treat these situations similarly. You would say, okay, the norms call for it. Somebody more powerful than me is telling me to comply with the norms. I will sit down and be quiet. I'll treat both situations the same way, and I'll do it without even thinking about it. I'll do it automatically. But for a kid growing up in a tougher neighborhood, this takes on a different texture. So, for example, if somebody comes up to them and is trying to push them around in their neighborhood, they can't always give in. If they do, they're going to be made a victim again and again. Sometimes they might need to fight back to preserve their reputation as somebody who can't be constantly victimized. So in some occasions, it makes sense to fight back. But now, when your teacher's telling you to sit down and be quiet, now if you respond the same way and say, oh, this is about preserving my reputation, I'd better fight back, now you might have made a mistake. Now you might end up sent to the principal's office or suspended or expelled. You cannot afford to treat both of these situations the same. You cannot act automatically. I think this is important because I think some kids growing up in tougher neighborhoods might shoulder a burden that affluent kids might not, which is that they cannot afford to think fast. They have to think slow because in some neighborhoods, like on the south side of Chicago, the code of the street can be different from the code of the classroom. And there's so many codes and situations that they need to be attuned to. I think that's what a program like BAM or the CBT-based programming in the Cook County Detention Center are doing. It's getting kids to pause and say, well, are these situations the same, or is there a way in which they might be different? To put a question in their mind and ask, what am I really looking at here? What could I be missing? Is it possible that this person has a weapon? And if so, would that change how I respond? Is it possible that I'm never going to see this person again? And so do I really need to think about my reputation in front of them? Is it possible that if I just ask for the ball, they might give it to me? I think the core lesson here could be summarized by a quote that one of the juvenile detention center counselors says to his kids. He says, look, if I could let you redo 10 minutes of your lives, none of you would be here. I think this is something that many of us can relate to. We've all we have all had moments where you say, I wish I could do that again. Except many of us are probably fortunate enough where thinking too fast for a few minutes doesn't have super severe repercussions. But for kids growing up in disadvantage, a few minutes of thinking too quickly can have tragic consequences. And so I think one thing that these programs do is they help kids navigate a bit of that situational uncertainty and ask, well, what am I really looking at here? And if you're bought into the idea that this situational uncertainty can fuel some conflict that compromises safety, then I want you to think about another circumstance where that uncertainty arises and where it can compromise community safety. And one place where we often see situational uncertainty, what am I really looking at here, is in interactions between police officers and community members. And we know that police-community interactions far too often have adverse consequences, whether it's uses of excessive force or even unnecessary arrests that could have been avoided. And if you want to think, look, it's clearly the case that these adverse outcomes in policing are determined by many factors. Some of it could be bad apples among officers. Some of it could be deficient department policies or a lack of accountability and insufficient oversight. But I want us to also think for a moment about how some uncertainty about what is the nature of this interaction could be driving these outcomes as well. So imagine, for example, that an officer sees a man rushing towards him down a dark street or dark alley, and the man is shouting something unintelligible, and the officer sees a glint of something in this man's hand. Now, one possible interpretation of the situation, the officer might say that glint is a weapon, and they might respond as such. That might even be their first impression. But of course, there's other interpretations that one could have of the situation instead. Perhaps the person is inebriated, and the glint is a bottle. Perhaps the person is injured, and they're shouting for help, and the glint is their cell phone because they're calling for help. Those are all different interpretations that you could go through. But if the officer, like the kids in that fist exercise, just go with their first impression and assume that the glint is a weapon, well, then they might respond with force when perhaps the situation does not call for it. And so while we did not develop the BAM program or the CBT program in the Juvenile Detention Center, we did develop a program that's basically like BAM, but for police officers. And we called it situational decision making. And to summarize a little bit of it, the gist of it is we're trying to get officers to ask, what else could I be missing in any given situation? We use a lot of scenario-based training where after officers are done with the scenarios, we keep pushing them to think about what was in their blind spot. So when officers started this training, they said, look, we don't Monday morning quarterback each other. If an officer made a decision, they made that decision based on their understanding of the totality of the circumstances. This program is trying to get them to, if not question others, then to at least think for themselves, is there another way that I could have seen this situation instead? And one way to fuel this is we, again, draw on the CBT literature to introduce these different cognitive distortions that might narrow officers' perspectives on situations. So one distortion we talk about is catastrophizing, where you assume the worst possible outcome might happen. Now, again, this program, though, isn't just telling officers you always assume there's too much threat. We also talk about minimizing, where they might overlook threats to their safety. We also talk quite a bit about personalization, where you assume that somebody else's actions are about you. Oh, this person's trying to antagonize me. When in fact, they might be yelling not because they're trying to antagonize you, the officer, but because they're having a bad day by virtue of the fact that they are interacting with the police in the first place. So we evaluated this by randomizing 2,000 officers. They either, half of them get CITD, half of them fulfill their training hours through existing trainings at Chicago's police department. And so before I get to the field outcomes, let's say we bring back the control and trained officers into the lab. We have them do a number of assessments. And just to summarize what we see there, we see that trained officers are, in fact, thinking through multiple ways of seeing a situation. For example, when a driver disobeys their commands, they're not just saying, I'm going to take enforcement action against this person, but they're also thinking through, is there a possibility that this person needs help? So then when we look at what's actually happening in the field, we find that this training indeed reduces adverse outcomes in the field 4 months after the training. So we find that there's a 23% reduction in uses of non-lethal force. So we just don't have statistical power to detect changes in lethal force. It's relatively rare, statistically speaking, in our sample. We also find a similar 23% reduction in a category of arrests that we call discretionary arrests. These are arrests that officers could avoid making. And they might be for things like obstructing an officer or disorderly conduct. One of my co-authors on this paper is Sandy Jo MacArthur, a former assistant chief of police at LAPD, where she was has been on the forefront of training for decades. And she says these arrests might be made almost in a retaliatory manner. So they're arrests that could have been avoided. The other thing I'll highlight is that for our arrest data, we also have data on race of the arrestee. We find that these reductions are entirely concentrated in officers reducing their discretionary and other arrests of Black civilians. What's striking is that even though this training program does not discuss implicit or explicit bias, it is still reducing racial disparities in policing by getting officers to move past that first impression. Now, you might wonder, okay, you can get reductions in any police activity if officers are just doing less of everything. So does your training just get officers to pull back entirely? That's not the case. We can look at an index of all other officer activities from parking citations to recovered guns. We see there's no meaningful change in officer activity. You might also wonder, well, if you're getting officers to do something out of the norm for them, is that compromising their safety? And no, if anything, it's actually improving their safety, reducing days off due to injury by about 50%. Right? So, taken together, at the outset, I said that these are not anti-poverty programs per se, but I hope this talk didn't feel like too much of a tangent, because one type of uncertainty poverty creates in the community is about, well, how safe am I, and where are the threats to my safety? And I think one thing that might undermine community safety or create conflict is uncertainty about, well, what is the nature of my interaction with this person right now? And humans are not well equipped for this kind of uncertainty. We often respond to situations too quickly, but hopefully at least these few interventions convince you that there is value in trying to diagnose where does this uncertainty about situations, social situations, exist in people's lives, and how can we better equip them to navigate it? I'll stop there. Thanks.
It's a question for Anuj. I'm curious what you think about the scale up of potential programs that rely on CBT type training. So in all of these situations, I guess with the BAM study, it's a facilitator with a medium-sized group of students. With the police study, each officer has to kind of engage in these trainings. And I've heard of other types of things through mobile stuff, like WhatsApp groups, chatbots. I'm curious, what's your sense of the lay of the land of thinking about creative ways, either through there's a rise in community counseling or peer-based counseling, ways that I guess you can either have spillovers between people, so people who are targeted and how those skills can spill over to other people, or how to engage people just more as a collective in kind of learning about these situational awareness skill sets.
So I'm going to jump in then. Why don't we take a few questions and then we'll send it back to the panel.
Thank you. My name is Mario. I'm a visiting PhD working with the political theory people at the politics department. So I have a question for Anuj and one for Pascaline. So for Anuj, you talked a lot about situational uncertainty, but it seems to me that the examples you gave are more about people having a lot of certainty. So for me, as a philosopher, it was like I want to unravel exactly what these programs are doing. Is it more maybe not to help people navigate uncertainty, but just to make them aware of the existence of it? Because the way you said it, I don't know, it creates some noise. And to Pascaline, I was thinking about, like, I was really shocked by the example of the free meal as an indicator of poverty. So I want to know a bit more about that. Like, I assume it's very culturally specific, but how did you come out with that question? As somebody from Latin America, I cannot imagine how getting the free meal would signal poverty in any way in my particular culture. So I really wonder what was behind this. Was the meal that was being offered a very cheap meal, or how come this was something that signaled poverty? Thank you.
One more question, and we'll send it back.
Yes. Well, it seems to me there's a lot of macroeconomic factors in terms of precarity that we have to pay attention to also. According to the Federal Reserve, household debt, which includes things like mortgage debt, auto loans, things like that. According to the Federal Reserve, the total household debt on the United States economy comes to $16 trillion. That's with a T. And that averages out to about $48,000 a head. And I mean, you talk about precarity. People are constantly broke, carrying these impossible levels of debt. And, any thoughts about what we can do to change that? And I do have one suggestion. The UAW, in their recent strike demands, wanted the work week cut from 5 days to 4 with no reduction in pay. If carried out across the goods-producing industries, you'd have about 6 million new union-scale jobs. So, that would be a big precarity reduction right there. So, I don't know. Responses, please?
So let me just maybe throw one more question in, and then you guys can close out the panel. First of all, I found each of the presentations to be fascinating, and in many ways, I think the logic of decision-making was a little bit different across the three. And so I guess, since I want to pose this question, starting off with Seema, since the question wasn't yet posed to you, how does the work presented by Pascaline in terms of thinking about perceptions, decisions of perceptions, and how others will receive it, and then the comments by Anuj about situational uncertainty and being able to learn how to reflect in situations that might be different, shape the way you think about your own work, which, if I were to summarize the presentation, was in part about people responding to the structural conditions that they face, perhaps differentially along gender lines. So in other words, how does the logic of perception decision-making that the others highlighted maybe inform the work that you do? And we'll send it back. Why don't we start with Anuj and we'll end with Seema.
So I'll try to work my way backwards through some of the questions. So on the point about uncertainty, I think we're actually saying something very similar, which is that, yes, in people's minds, there's initially too much certainty about what it is that they're looking at. And that certainty might be mismatched with the fact that there's more variability in their situations than they might initially appreciate. So it is, I guess, trying to reduce some of that initial certainty about what it is that they're seeing to be open to the possibility that there's another way to see it, as it were. Alex, to your questions, I think there's two questions in there. So let me start with the scale question. So I don't yet know that we have a great answer on how to scale these. In fact, from BAM, we know that when they started scaling in other cities like Boston and so forth, that the effects started getting much smaller. And I think part of that is a people problem that it takes, in the case of BAM, charismatic counselors to deliver this training. Like when you look at the curriculum, it's maybe 50 sheets of paper, and then it's their job to kind of bring it to life. And so there's a problem of, well, not just how do we get enough people to serve the people who need the program, but how do we actually find the people who can bring this thing to life? I think one issue is that there's so much that goes into BAM, but also even into CIT-D, where we don't yet know, like, what are the components that matter most. So I think one thing we need to do is get better at distilling down what are like the modules of that we can sort of train more directly. I can talk with you offline about how we're now starting to think about that. And then I don't know that I'm optimistic about the app-based approach that you mentioned before. I think this requires a little bit more engagement, but I do think that we should be seeing, I think, positive spillovers where in the police department, for example, I think one reason why we're seeing fade out is you only had 1,000 officers out of like 10,000 patrol officers who were trained in this new way of approaching different situations. I think as a guess, that we would have seen longer lasting effects if there were other people who could reinforce that behavior. Now, it's not quite this officer training this other officer, but it's about someone around you having the same habits of thought as you to kind of reinforce it, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So about why a free meal would be a signal of poverty, I agree. We all take free meals all the time. I think most of you are here because there was a free meal outside. But I guess here, in the context that we are looking at, okay, it's more about the opportunity cost. So we are offering you the choice between a free meal and something else, which is like a tote bag or a kitchen or a pen, which is kind of like a luxury good, in some sense. And so you're choosing between the two. And so maybe here, if you had a choice between a tote bag and a fancy Pierce tote bag, maybe some of you would have taken the tote bag rather than a free meal, because you don't need a free meal to have food on the table. Okay, so this is really thinking about not choosing the luxury item if you are closer to subsistence versus being able to afford taking the luxury item when you don't eat food. So by taking, maybe I should show it the other way and say the likelihood that you pick the luxury item is higher if you think that they're going to be screened based on some factors. And I think even in Latin America, I would suspect that it would be perceived in the same way. And then on the issue of household debt. So first, I appreciate the fact that you came here convinced that in a 1.5 hour panel on global poverty and precarity, we would be able to address every single aspect of it. Your faith in academia is amazing, but
I'm a little hard of hearing. You have to kind of yell at me.
Okay, all right. I say I appreciate the fact that you thought we were going to be able to address all factors pertaining to the topic of global poverty and precarity in a 1.5 hour panel. It was not our understanding that we were supposed to be exhaustive, so that's why we're just like picked on very small aspects of the question. So I'm sorry if you thought we were going to be painting a big picture of all these issues. I completely agree with you that household debt is an issue. On a very specific proposal that you have, I think economists sometimes would kind of disagree on the premise that there's a fixed amount of jobs to be had and a fixed number of hours to be worked. One example of such a reform happened in France, my home country, a while back now, where we moved to the 35-hour work week, which is very similar to what you're describing. And the reality is that the wage growth doesn't keep up. So for a short time, you can keep people having the same wage, working fewer hours, which is de facto a greater hourly wage. But then over time, as inflation kicks in, if the wage is not increased, you get back to a real wage, which is very similar to what it was before. So it's kind of, in the short run, it may look like it's solving the problem, but in the long run, it doesn't really make a difference. Although I think it would very well be beneficial to people to have a different trade-off between leisure and consumption in the U.S. Than they currently have, but that's a different story.
You asked me a hard question, and then I listened to their answers. I was planning to come up with my answer, but I found both the presentations fascinating. I'm going to try to tackle half of it. I think that what Pascaline talked about in terms of perceptions and, certainly comes into a lot of my work. Maybe not around perceptions of poverty, but around, I think a lot of adherence to gender norms, even when it's leaving money on the table, is because of a broader perception that maybe in our economic models that are thinking about maximizing savings or something like that, we leave out, so that there's some, signaling of there's a slippery slope to a husband if he's giving his wife some control over money that he wants to avoid. And, in terms of the other way that it plays in is in terms of perceptions of poverty, there's also some evidence on labor markets and adjustments that suggest people won't take lower wage jobs. And, often the interpretation of that is some sort of like collusion among workers to kind of prop up wages, at least in the short run. I guess, Pascaline's another kind of way you can extend what you said is to think of that as, not people not being willing to take a lower paying job because that would signal they're desperate. And, there's no free lunch there. That means that if wages are sticky, they don't fall during recessions, then the way the labor market adjusts is through more unemployment rather than everybody getting a 5% pay cut. But that's something interesting I thought about in the context of labor markets related to Pascaline's point.
Mission of these Global Existential Challenges seminars is to initiate conversations that we hope will spill into other rooms as we think about both the specific work that our colleagues have done, and thank you, the three of you, for these incredible presentations, but also for us to puzzle through as we walk out how to think about the structural conditions, the perceptual conditions, the Bayesian updating in a way that was talked about at the end, so that we can puzzle through both the big questions of global poverty and precarity, but also to think about them in situ, whether or not we're talking about India, Burkina Faso, or even the south side of Chicago. So thank you all for starting the conversations with all of us, and also I look forward to the ones that will follow. Thank you.